When it comes to orthopedic oncology, tackling malignant musculoskeletal tumors is all about having a systematic, principled game plan. So today, we're going to break down that exact framework, from the moment you suspect a tumor all the way to surgical strategy. Okay, so let's set the scene. You've identified a suspected sarcoma. The big question is, what now? Well, there's a really solid framework that guides every single decision, from the initial workup to the definitive surgery. And that's exactly what we're going to walk through together.
All right, here's our game plan. First, we'll cover the basics of musculoskeletal sarcomas. Then, we'll jump into the GTM staging system, which is huge. After that, we'll look at the diagnostics, imaging, and biopsy that feed into that system. Then, we'll see how that staging directly leads to our treatment plan. And we'll wrap up with the key surgical takeaways you absolutely need to know.
Okay, first things first, we have to nail down the single most critical distinction in the entire world of sarcomas, and that is the histological grade. Seriously, this one factor drives everything from prognosis to how aggressive we need to be with our treatment.
At the very heart of managing sarcomas is figuring out its biological behavior. Are we looking at a G1, a low-grade tumor that's less likely to spread, or are we up against a G2, a high-grade, super-aggressive malignancy? Answering that one question is the critical first domino that sets everything else in motion.
So let's break that down. Think of G1 tumors as, well, more orderly. Their cells kind of look like mature tissue, so they tend to grow slower. But G2 tumors, they're the opposite. They're cellularly chaotic, totally disorganized, and poorly differentiated. And that chaos you see under the microscope, it translates directly into real-world aggression. We're talking rapid growth, invasion, and a much higher risk of metastasis. This is why our treatment strategies for G1 and G2 have to be completely different.
All right, so now let's talk about the framework that ties all this together, the GTM system, also known as the Ewing classification. The best way to think about this is as our blueprint. It's what translates all our diagnostic findings into a clear, actionable surgical plan. And the real magic of this system is how it takes three totally separate variables and combines them into one single actionable stage. See, it's not enough to just know the grade. You have to combine that biological aggressiveness, the G, with its anatomical location, the T, and whether or not there's distant disease, which is the M. So here are the three pillars. G is for grade, pretty simple, low or high. T is for tumor site. This tells us if the tumor is neatly contained within one anatomical compartment, say a single muscle, or if it's broken out. And M, of course, is for metastasis. Do we see distant disease or not? You have to nail down all three of these to get the stage right. Okay, so the big question is, how do we actually figure out the G, the T, and the M? It's really a two-pronged attack. We use advanced imaging to map out the anatomy, and we need a tissue diagnosis to define the biology. So we always start with imaging. X-rays and CT scans are great for giving us a sense of the bone's structural integrity, but MRI, that is the absolute gold standard for looking at soft tissue extension, which is just crucial for figuring out the T stage. And then we use something like scintigraphia or a PET scan to screen the whole body for metabolic activity. That's how we hunt for the M stage. And listen, this is a point I really want to drive home. Imaging is fantastic for defining the tumor's anatomical footprint, the T and the M, but it absolutely cannot tell you the grade. Only a pathologist looking at an actual tissue sample under a microscope can give you that definitive G. All right, so now it's time to connect the dots. Once we have a definitive stage in hand, we can start applying the principles of oncologic surgery. And the key thing to remember is that our treatment plan is never just a guess. It is dictated directly by that GTN stage we worked so hard to determine. But before we can link stage to treatment, we've got to speak the same language when it comes to surgical margins. Think of it like a ladder of surgical aggressiveness. At the bottom, you might have an intralesional procedure, just scooping it out. Then you move up to marginal, then wide excision with a cuff of normal tissue, all the way to a radical excision of the entire compartment. When we're talking about sarcomas, we are living at the top end of this ladder.
So for a stage 1, that's our low-grade G1 sarcoma, the guiding principle is wide excision. The whole goal here is local control. That means we have to resect the tumor with a planned margin of healthy tissue surrounding it on all sides. This is how we slash the risk of local recurrence.
Okay, but what about a stage 2 high-grade sarcoma? Now the game completely changes. Because these things are so aggressive and love to invade locally, our surgical principle has to escalate to a radical excision. We're talking about removing the entire anatomical compartment that contains the tumor. It's the only way to get the most definitive local control we can.
And then there's stage 3. This is when the patient has distant metastases, and the whole paradigm shifts. Our goal is no longer a simple surgical cure. Instead, management becomes this really complex, multidisciplinary effort that's completely tailored to the individual. It often involves systemic chemotherapy, radiation, and using surgery more for palliative reasons, like controlling pain at a specific site. You know, getting the cancer out is really only half the battle. We also have to restore function for the patient. Reconstruction is always tailored to the defect we create. So for resections near a joint, in the epiphysis or metaphysis, we're often looking at these big, individual tumor endoprostheses. But for defects in the middle of the bone, the diaphysis, an intramedullary nail can provide great stability. At the end of the day, the goal is always the same: a functional, durable limb.
All right, let's boil all of this down. What are the most critical, high-yield principles that you absolutely have to carry with you into clinical practice?
Okay, if you remember nothing else from this explainer, remember these 4 pillars. First, staging dictates treatment. It's not a suggestion, it's the rule. Second, grade is king. That G1 versus G2 distinction drives every decision we make. Third, biopsy is definitive. You cannot make the call on imaging alone. And finally, margins matter. In sarcoma surgery, it is all about getting a clean, complete oncologic removal.
And that really brings us to a final forward-looking question. We've firmly established that surgery is the cornerstone for local control. But for these high-grade sarcomas that have such a high potential to metastasize, how do we use systemic treatments, like chemotherapy, either before or after surgery, to hunt down and destroy that micrometastatic disease and actually improve a patient's survival? That's one of the biggest questions in musculoskeletal oncology today.